have attended before. It's great to see so many of you. Just notice, please, that Helen has pressed the record button. That does mean that you are, you're being recorded. If you don't wish to be recorded, then the only thing is either stay silent, off video, or leave altogether. But please do stay and consent, so that's okay. Just a few house rules. We do encourage you, please, to stay on mute when you're not speaking. And rather than, because it's very difficult to see so many people on screen, rather than put your hand up to ask a question when we come to the questions, perhaps if you could use the chat function, and you can use the chat functions throughout the talks as well, and then I can gather the themes and relay those to people and as we do the questions later. Great. Just in case anyone didn't know, I'm Richard Astle and I'm the chairman of Natural Cambridgeshire. Many of my fellow trustees are with us today from the charity, and we will be spending the last 15 minutes or so of the meeting just to sort of updating you on our work and reporting on our activities over the course of the last year. A sort of non-formal annual kind of review. What I'd like to do, though, is kick off today's meeting, which, as you'll see, has been structured around this key question: how will we get enough water in years to come? And I know for many of you, it's probably the biggest topic on our environmental agenda, and one that I think many people have been wrestling with for quite some time, but that seems to become more acute each year. So we have speakers today from Water Resources East, not East. Daniel Johns will kick us off. He's MD there. And then Chris Gerrard from Anglian Water will talk about how Anglian Water's plans can help the natural environment in Cambridgeshire. At that point, we'll take questions and have a bit of a discussion on the water agenda before we have presentations from Justin Tilley of Natural England and Megan Hudson from the Fenland Soil Project, and then the Natural Cambridgeshire AGM. And we will finish, as usual, on the dot at 12. I've already seen that one or two of you have to leave early. That's fine. Thank you for joining us anyway, and we look forward to hearing from you as we go forward. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask Daniel to talk to us. Daniel I think, have you been there for a year now, Daniel? Is that right?
Yes, right. I started back in January. Yeah.
Yeah, so nearly a year at Water Resources East. And I'm going to keep saying that. I don't know why. I'm going to pause and let you carry on, Daniel. Over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, no, it's great to be invited to kind of present this morning. And it's, as the introduction said, it's all about water. It's about water resources, and it's about leaving enough water in the environment to achieve nature recovery and good ecological status within our water bodies. I'll go into more detail, of course, as we get into the slide pack. Hopefully everyone can see the slides on their screen. Quick introduction to Water Resources East, in case you've not come across this before. I'm sure you will have now. Water Resources East was set up originally by Anglian Water together with the other water companies, but deliberately on a multi-sector basis because the water resource challenges are so acute in the East. And because it's not just about the public water supply. When we're thinking about environmental improvement, that all water, major water using sectors were invited to take part in Water Resources East. And we're delighted that so many are now represented, not only on our board, which gives us that independence from water companies and any other individual member, but also the 180 or so individual members that form our wider stakeholder community, including Natural Cambridgeshire. I was really pleased to see that logo on the screen this morning. We also have a consultation group with regulators, the government, and the Drinking Water Inspectorate, the Environment Agency, Forestry Commission, which we work very closely with in plotting and planning our water resources on a long-term basis to make sure that we are meeting both regulatory requirements and also more environmentally ambitious destinations for the 2040s and 2050s. We were delighted last month on the 14th of November to publish our first ever long-term water resources plan for the East of England. It's as required under the National Framework for Water Resources, but it's the first time we've set out in full exactly where we think we can find the water from in future to meet the growing supply-demand deficits, and importantly, to return water to nature. And the conclusions, the headline conclusions of the report were quite stark, that urgent action is needed by all water using sectors in order to manage this region's scarce water resources. And the map on the left shows you a projection of the kind of the do nothing projection for 2050 in terms of the scale of the supply demand deficits that will open up within different parts of the east of England. We know that the Environment Agency has already classified the entire region as severely water stressed. 92% of rivers in our region are below good ecological status. That's not just about water resources, but water resources is a significant factor in many of those water bodies failing to achieve good. The overall projection for water shortages is about 640 million litres of water per day by 2050. So that's about a quarter of current water use across different sectors. And unless we take urgent action, then the economy, the environment, and plans for growth, both within individual industries, within agriculture, and within the housing sector, will be curtailed and constrained until we sort this out. And of course, the environment will continue to suffer. We'll continue to see just not enough water within watercourses to support nature and support nature's recovery. Just to go through the numbers in more detail, and I'll circulate these slides after the presentation this morning, just so you can see them in detail, because obviously there's too much to go through just in a kind of short slot that I've got. But all these charts are available in the report itself, available on the website. But in short, the overall message is we're using a lot of water today, which is what's on the left-hand side. About 85% of it is for the public water supply, but a very significant proportion is for agriculture, for spray irrigation in particular, about 10%. And when you look at the right-hand side, in terms of where the growth in water demand is going to come from, it's predominantly going to come from those other sectors like spray irrigation, which actually outpaces the growth in housing and business use of the public water supply, but also things like energy as well. So energy uses very little water today, about 4 million litres of water per day. And depending on what happens with hydrogen generation, depending on what happens with the rollout of carbon capture and storage, particularly within the east of England, where there are some remaining fossil fuel power stations, then you could see very significant increases in water use for power. And that's one of the things that we know we need to do more of to actually understand exactly how much water may be used, because the projections on the energy side are quite uncertain. But certainly the overall message is that demand for water is increasing, and the amount of water available from existing sources, existing abstraction points, is going to decline quite rapidly across the whole area. So that's driven initially in the short term on the left-hand side by caps and license constraints imposed by the Environment Agency in order to meet no deterioration requirements under the Water Framework Directive. So about 150 million litres per day. And that's on top of savings that water companies have already made, licence caps that have already accepted as part of the last round of water resource management planning. By 2040, the government has asked us to deliver even greater drought resilience. So to make sure the chance of severe drought restrictions falls from about 1 in 200, which will be in place by 2025, to 1 in 500 by 2040. So that needs an additional 85 million litres of water per day. Climate change is with us already, is already having an impact on weather patterns, weather systems, on seasonal temperatures, rainfall. But in order to make sure that we can achieve the other kind of the drought resilient standards, the environmental desolation standards in the changing climate, then we need to find about 23 million litres of water per day. So it's a less amount, but certainly a significant amount across the next 20 to 25 years or so. But the big reductions really need to be achieved by 2050 at the very latest, and hopefully a lot sooner, by, again, further licence reductions, further caps, further imposition of hands-off flow restrictions during kind of summer months when flows are short. And that's as much as 330 litres, million litres per person, 330 million litres per day for the public water supply. But also those kind of abstraction caps and restrictions will be applied to agriculture as well, and to energy and the other water using sectors. So really quite significant reductions in water, primarily to drive that environmental improvement, to achieve good ecological status within watercourses by returning rivers to meet those minimum environmental flow conditions. And those changes, those license restrictions, will not be imposed in a uniform way across the country, across the region, of course. It will be imposed in more severe and acute ways in different parts, depending on the sensitive nature of local ecology and the level of over-obstruction that we have at present. So across the top, you've got maps of where the licence caps are likely to be imposed for the public water supply, with the kind of the do minimum, legal minimum on the left-hand side scenario, with increasingly ambitious environmental destinations through to the right-hand side. And on the bottom, similar picture. So environmentally, the legal minimum on the left, what we're calling the enhanced destination on the right-hand side for agriculture across the bottom. And what they show is that in some cases, by 2050, both the public water supply and agriculture could lose about 60% of existing licence volumes. So that's really quite a significant change in licence caps and restrictions that will be coming through, probably in a progressive nature rather than obviously kind of one-off cuts, in order to achieve those good ecological flows. And it's also worth noting that WRE, the WRE board, in signing off the plan, endorsed the most ambitious environmental destination scenario. So it endorsed the right-hand side scenarios, both for public water supply and for agriculture. But in order to be consistent with the water company plans and be consistent with the other regions, the main numbers and the main plans within our documents are based on the business as usual plus scenario, the resilience scenario, which you see in the middle of this chart. What that gives you for the public water supply, with growth going up, growth in water demand going up, and in the availability of water going down, is this really quite significant, sizable demand, supply-demand deficit opening up, starting in the late 2020s, growing as you get into 2030s, and by the time you get to 2040, and the need to both deliver the environmental destination scenarios as quickly as possible and achieve that additional, more secure drought resilient standard, you end up with the sizable, say, 640 million litres per day water demand deficit by 2050. And it shows you in this chart the difference between achieving the recovery, the business as usual, the legal minimum standard on the right-hand side, the resilience, which is the one our plan is based on at the moment, and WRA's ambition is to achieve enhance. And what we're saying, first of all, is that our plan is baked on business as usual plus. And in the first 5 years of the plan, we want to conduct further investigations with our water company members on a multi-sector basis to understand how exactly we can jump from the resilience BAU plus path to the enhanced path as quickly as possible, so we achieve those environmental outcomes, not just by 2050, not by 2040, but hopefully a lot sooner than that. How the plan then stacks up is shown on this chart. On the left-hand side, first of all, importantly, demand management is the first part of the plan, which has already begun. Water companies already have demand management strategies, leakage control programs, and that will be ramped up as part of the plan. So you can see on the right-hand side, the very darkest blue kind of wedge is to do with demand management and leakage reduction. So that achieves about a quarter of the supply and demand deficit by 2050. And then you build into the plan the kind of smaller options, the transfers, and by the time you get to the 2030s, water reuse schemes, which is about taking wastewater at water recycling centres, treating it to an environmental standard, putting it back into a reservoir, putting it back into a watercourse, and then re-abstracting it for a further treatment to drinking water standard to put it back into supply. So rather than that water being used once and then going out to the North Sea and then coming back through the full water cycle, we're kind of cutting the corner there. We are treating it both to the environmental standard and to the drinking water standard, just so we can use as much water as we can as efficiently as possible within the region. What the plan also shows is that we will need desalination by the time we get to the 2040s. There's no way to square the full supply demand deficit without opting for desal at some point. We want to minimize that. We want to push it back because it is energy intensive. It does have environmental consequences in terms of disposing of the kind of the brine residue that's created through desalination. But in order to achieve the volume of reductions for the environment, and desalination has to be part of the picture. But in the middle there, you've got the two new reservoir projects, which again, you can't meet the supply demand deficit of this scale within the east of England without additional and major new sources of water storage. And the two projects that are now been launched, they are both subject to public consultation right now, closing next week, is the South Links Reservoir up near Sleaford and the reservoir in the Cambridgeshire Fens just northeast of Chatteris. So I do encourage you to see, to look on the Anglian Water, Cambridge Water public consultation pages to have you update on these projects.
Oh.
You carry on, Daniel.
Thank you. Yeah, in terms of how and where the projects will start to roll out, these charts show you just exactly in kind of time slices. First, in the 2030 time slice on the left and 2035 on the right. You'll see that one of the major parts of the programme is to build upon the major transfer pipeline that's already being built by Anglian Water. So the blue dotted line that threads its way through the region down into Essex is already being built and should be online by 2025. And that provides the kind of backbone for these other options to plug into. You've also got additional transfers of water between different parts of the region to make sure the water that is available is there in the right place at the right time, and including an additional new transfer, an interim transfer between Anglian Water's Grafham Reservoir and the Cambridge Water region. You see the little grey arrow toward the bottom left, and that is an important part of the plan in order to allow Cambridge Water to step back from some of its existing obstructions much sooner than they otherwise would be able to. But by the time you get to 2035, we hopefully will have the Fenns Reservoir built near Chatteris. We'll also see some of those reuse schemes coming in around the East Anglian coastline, Lowestoft, Colchester and Southend. And by the time we get to 2040, we'll both see some of those first desalination plants come online, plus also the South Links Reservoir near Sleaford. That's an important part of the picture. By the time we get to 2050, well, most of the work actually will have been done by 2040. So 2050 is just some additional smaller options in making sure we make best use of those desalinations. We've got all the transfers in place, and therefore that's the kind of the full picture for what we call in the best value plan. Best value because it's not just about what is best from the public water supply perspective, but also delivers a maximum benefit for the environment, for agriculture, for energy production and the other water using sectors. So that's the overall plan. The right-hand side shows you the chart I've just presented, but the left-hand side is we tried to do this in one page. So yeah, demand for water going up, available water in the environment going down, a stepped kind of five-year pathway toward 2050, which starts into our management, gets you into the reservoir projects, and ends up with additional desal because there's no other source of supply within the east. We will soon kind of run out of road on new storage options, run out of road on reuse. And so desal is definitely part of the longer term picture. But what we're delivering is better drought resilience for the region, moving from 1 in 200 to 1 in 500 by 2040. And most importantly, a huge amount of water taken out of existing abstraction licenses and left back in the environment for nature, because that's at the heart of the plan. The environmental destination driven by the Environment Agency and Ofwat's requirements is what the plan is after all about. We also give a brief update in the plan about some of our kind of catchment-based projects, and that's certainly the way that WRE is going. And we hear from the Environment Agency and Ofwat that that's the way that the national framework will go as well. So making sure we kind of, on the back of the regional scale planning, look much more on a catchment scale about what's happening within individual river systems and catchments, to apply the water resource modelling and learnings that we've gathered over the last couple of years to build on some of the tools we've developed as part of Water for Tomorrow. We've got some work going on the Granted Chalk Streams project funded through the Environment Agency. And so we would love to have a kind of portfolio, a growing portfolio of projects that cover every part of the east of England, so that we can say we're going to find the water that we need to restore the environment, to support housing growth in the economy and to support agriculture as well. So the consultation is open until the 20th of February. There's an online form, which hopefully will make it really easy to respond. There are 8 questions to shape your responses, but of course, any and all feedback is welcome. You can also write to us by email or by post to waterresources@UEA. I'll leave it there, Richard, and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Daniel. Congratulations, being bang on time. I think what we felt would be the best thing to do is to hear from Chris next, and then we can have a sort of general discussion about and questions based on the 2 presentations. So we've got quite a lot of questions building up in the chat. So Daniel, you might want to have a look at those so you're prepared for what we'll have. But I'm going to invite Chris to join us now from Anglian Water. Hi, Chris, how are you? And Chris is going to talk to us about the opportunities for nature recovery through Anglian Water's work. I think that's right, Chris. You
Richard,
okay?
hi everyone.
Lovely. Thank you.
Hi Richard, yeah, nice to join you all. So my presentation is going to focus on more on terrestrial biodiversity work that we're doing as a business. I do touch on a couple of water quality issues at the end of the presentation though. So Helen, if you can move on to the next slide, that'd be great, thank you. So I wanted to start by talking about our sources of drinking water, really, because our nature protection work, I guess, goes on both on our assets and across the region as a whole. But some of what we do for protecting wider environmental quality relates to how we engage with farmers to protect the raw water quality in rivers, because then we're going to abstract that water and treat it and put it into supply. So the orange areas on the map that you can see there are all the catchments which drain into rivers from which we then abstract. And if you zero in Cambridgeshire, you can see the Grafham water there. It's just that sort of red smudge west of Huntingdon, and then upstream of that is the Great Ouse catchment that we abstract water from. So anything that a farmer does in that area could have an impact on water quality. Yeah, any drainage coming off roads, all of those sorts of impacts that we're all familiar with, impacts raw water quality, and then has impacts on how well we can treat that water before putting it into supply. And for us, key concerns would be pesticides, nutrients, and turbidity. Turbidity being water with silt in it, which causes a real problem for us and often means we have to stop abstracting when there is too much turbidity in the water. Next slide, please, Helen. So we've been working with farmers for a long time. I've got a team of catchment advisors in my team who go and engage with farmers around our reservoirs and in our catchments, engage with them in many ways. It's primarily around encouraging them, working with them to find ways that they can manage their land and achieve their aims in a way that helps to protect water quality. And a couple of examples on the screen here are the use of cover crops over winter. So growing up around Cambridgeshire when I was a kid, there was lots of deep ploughing going on, and now much less of that happening at all. So lots of farmers using green cover in winter to protect the quality of the soil, stop it washing off the land, and to hold on to nutrients in the soil. And that protects water quality and has benefits for us as well. So we provide grants and advice on those sorts of activities. Similarly, on the right, this is a low-till, zero-till machine, enabling farmers to put their seed into the ground without having to rely on deeper ploughing. And all of this protects the soil quality, encourages soil carbon, and of course protects soil biodiversity as well. One of the ways that we're working with farmers is in a project called LENS, Landscape Enterprise Networks, and that's where we're working with the likes of Nestle and Cargill and Affinity Water, paying farmers to deliver benefits for biodiversity and for water quality. This year, about £2.3 million worth of private investment going into work around our region to pay farmers to deliver these sorts of outputs at scale, including catchments in Cambridgeshire. Soil carbon is important. You can see the statistic there on the slide there at the bottom. Just shows how an increase in soil carbon can really benefit water holding capacity, and that provides some resilience for farmers against extreme weather events like the ones that we saw this year. Sorry. Next slide, please, Helen. So this is the sort of water resources position that we had over the very hot summer that seems like a distant memory now. The soil is essentially a big sponge lying across the landscape. And if it's in good condition with high degree of organic content, it can really hold on to a lot of water. And obviously that's very relevant for farmers holding on to a water supply to help to grow crops. And Daniel's obviously just talked through why that's important from a wider water resources perspective. Next slide, please, Helen. And I won't stop on this point for too long, but Daniel's mentioned the two reservoirs. This is the one proposed for Cambridgeshire, just north east of Chatteris. And so if you go to fensreservoir.co.uk, you can find out all the information about it there. I'm sure many of you have done that already. Next slide, please. So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about Anglian Water's own land, because a lot of our land has biodiversity interest or potential. And next slide, please, Helen. We've got about 7,000 sites across the region. Each dot on that map is one of our sites. We've got about 7,000 hectares of land, very small number of big sites and lots of tiny sites. About 50 sites of special scientific interest, although it's really 10 that particularly matter for us. Pretty well all of that is in favourable condition. 169 local wildlife sites and about 1,200 hectares of priority habitat, which is habitat which is thought to be of high enough value for biodiversity to warrant organisations like us and local authorities taking it as a material consideration in decision making. If you can move on, please. And we've assessed the value of our land using the Lawton principles, which will be familiar to many of you. Essentially, about 12 years ago, a group of people assessed the ecological network as it existed against a number of criteria, and it was found wanting across all of them apart from one. And the recommendations that came out has become a bit of a mantra in conservation, having better managed sites, bigger sites, more of them, and joining them up. And so we work with University of East Anglia to assess all of our sites against those criteria. And on the next slide, you'll see the results of that. Click on again, thank you. So the darker the purple and blue, the more valuable the sites are according to the Lawton principles. And you can see where Cambridgeshire is. And I guess the sort of South Cambridgeshire chalk area and the area around Graffham particularly stick out for me, but you can see some other sites of value as well. If you can move on, please. So if you look at that site list, and all of our sites are ranked from 1 down to about 6,500, there are 4 sites in Cambridgeshire that fall within the top 100, and those are the ones on the screen there. So Graffham Water, which won't be a surprise, Graffham Intake on the River Ouse, Flag, Fen and Stamford Water Recycling Centre. Next slide, please. So at Graffham, obviously it's a SSSI, high value for biodiversity, managed in partnership with the local wildlife trust, doing great work enhancing the nature reserve. They're really good for its birds. But at our site, we've got an opportunity to bring about 30 plus hectares of land out of production because the tenant is giving up the land. And what we're aiming to do there is to do a combination of woodland restoration and grassland creation, which will enhance the existing biodiversity around Graffham Water, contribute to the sort of long-held ambition between a number of local stakeholders to connect Graffham Water to Brampton Wood and down into the valley as well. So that's a very exciting piece of work we're looking to kick off in our next business planning period from 2025. Next slide, please. And down at Offord Intake, just near the Offord villages, we've got a woodland there, which you can see in the aerial photo. You see lines of trees there. This was an old nursery that was created when Graffham Water was built to do tree planting for the nature reserve and the wider environment there. So we've started some work to enhance this site. If you can just click on, please, Helen. So you can see what it looked like above, and we started to create, based on some recommendations from an independent ecologist, some additional habitat there which will enhance the site and potentially improve the site for nightingales. We've got nightingales at Graffham Water, nightingales in the Ouse Valley, and this will provide a bit of a connection for them. Next slide, please. One of the wider ambitions Anglian Water or pledges, commitments we've made is around tree planting and woodland creation. So we are looking for suitable sites on the Anglian Water land in particular for doing tree planting. It's partly linked to our net zero commitment. We need about 91,000 tonnes of carbon offsets from 2030 to be net zero, and all things being equal, we'd love to do that in our region. So if any stakeholders here have got projects on any sort of habitat creation projects that offers an offsetting opportunity, really interested to hear from you. Next slide, please. Just finally, before I move on to sort of wider water recycling issues, is Flag Fen. So Flag Fen archaeology site is in the top right of that corner. Peterborough is off to the northwest, and you can see our water recycling centre at the bottom there. That bare land in the middle is all owned by Anglian Water, or the vast majority of it. So I think there's a lot of potential here to do some habitat enhancement, which could provide public benefit, archaeological benefit as well. So I'm hoping to kick off an investigation, again, as part of our new business plan, to really dig into the detail about that, so we can create a potentially a very ambitious habitat restoration project. It'll need to be mindful of asset expansion at the works, but there's a lot of land there which I really hope we can do something really great with, which should support all the existing surrounding public and environmental benefits that are provided there. Okay, let's move on to water recycling, please. Next slide, Helen. We've got a lot of water recycling centres around our region. We've got about 1,200 in total, something like that. A lot of them look like this. They are expensive to build, got a high carbon footprint, a lot of chemical use as well. So we've been interested in looking at treatment wetlands as part of a lower carbon solution to meeting the water recycling quality needs that we need to meet. Next slide, please. So in Goldisthorpe in West Norfolk, you can see another traditional water recycling centre, but those large ponds in the top right hand of that picture is forming part of the treatment function, and on the right you can see what it looks like. So it provides treatment for ammonia, but in doing so it creates a biodiversity resource on land which was of very poor quality for biodiversity before that. So it's significantly enhancing its wildlife. Provides a bit of an amenity for local people, and of course provides the treatment function, and is a lower cost solution for us. So where we're able to do it, it's not suitable everywhere, we do want to do it. Next slide, please. This this business plan period, we've got 26 that we would like to do, and you can see Cambridgeshire there, and it's almost cut out of that. It looks like a couple might be just creeping into Cambridgeshire around the edge, but we've got 26 that we would like to deliver. It's all subject to local feasibility and agreement with local farmers, because we'll need land on which to create them. But where we can do them, we really do want to, because they're a much better solution all round, as long as they can meet the tight permit conditions that they need to meet. We're just in planning now for our next business plan period, so in a few months' time we'll start to have a better idea about what water recycling upgrades we'll be doing in 2025 to 2030, and we'll have a bit of a clue as to whether treatment wetlands can be a part of that solution as well. So very happy to come back to a future meeting to show you what that might look like for Cambridgeshire once we have that picture. Final few slides, so let's move on, please. On the Anglian Water website, on that address and that QR code, for those of you who are adept at using QR codes, there's a web page which shows what current upgrade plans are for our water recycling centres, but also provides information about storm overflows, which has been a lot of interest in the press about over the last couple of years. So do have a look at that website if you would like to have a look at your local patch and find out what's going on. Next slide, please. But on storm overflows, again, just like water recycling centres, we're right at the pointy end of business planning for them at the moment. And so early in the new year, we'll have a better picture of exactly what's work is going to be going on with storm overflow reduction as part of the Environment Act requirements that have emerged this year. The blue dots on that screen are sort of definite ones that are going to be delivered in the next business plan period. So that's where we're going to definitely taking action on storm overflows. The orange ones are still up for grabs. So they're possible and still being subject to assessment, and that's on top of the many millions of pounds worth of investment that's happened in the current business planning period to reduce storm overflows through things like tanks and investments like that. We're really keen to identify if there are nature-based solutions for storm overflows. It's a little bit more difficult, I think, but we do think there are some opportunities, so we'll be pursuing those where we can. Next slide, please. Just to finish off, you may have seen we've made a number of commitments under something called Get River Positive, where we're taking action on a number of things that we think are of interest to our customers and stakeholders. And I guess I'll point you to commitment 3 and 4, which is around enhancement for rivers. And I guess around commitment 3 is supporting others to improve and care for rivers. So if there are any stakeholders on the call today who are doing things with rivers in Cambridgeshire, then it's worth you letting us know about them to see whether there's opportunities for join up. We've been working with the organisations like the Cam Valley Forum, where we've been funding them to do river quality monitoring to help them and to help them to engage with us on planning for that river, for example. So if anybody's got other things that they would like to talk to us about, then please do drop us a line and we can get a conversation in the diary. Final slide, please. There's a bit of a canter through some of the biodiversity aspirations that we have for Cambridgeshire and Greater Peterborough as well. If you've got any other biodiversity aspirations for your area that you think you might be interested in, then please do drop me a line. I'll put my email address in the chat. So if you want to talk to me, then please just drop me an email. I'll be happy to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. If we could just, thank you, Helen. Fascinating presentations from both Daniel and Chris, and I can't keep pace with the number of questions. So what I was going to suggest actually is perhaps at some stage, I don't know whether you've got time to stay on, Chris and Daniel. There are some questions in the chat that I think only you can just require a quick response from you. They're sort of yes, no. Perhaps you could just go through some of those, and for instance, there's one about timelines on a consultation. But I'm going to try and bring the questions together. I'm not, if I miss anything, forgive me, and I will keep going back and making sure. But I think to start with, Daniel, can I come to you? There's a lot of questions around the reservoirs and around desalination. Questions around why not more reservoirs, why not quicker reservoirs, and why should we believe it this time because we've talked about them before and the investment hasn't happened. And then some skepticism, as I'm sure you'll be aware, around whether desalination is the right way forward and how you generate the energy for that. So if I could pose those to you first, and then I'm going to come back with some others. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah. So I've been keeping kind of note of all the questions. There are some fantastic questions in there. They're really, really good. So you're just on the reservoirs. We select both the South Links Reservoir and the Fens Reservoir as soon as they become available. I've just checked the consultation, and you're right. Was it? I can't remember who said the timing was different. So certainly, yeah, we understand the Fens Reservoir. If it's construction ready by the end of this decade, about 2029, then it could enter supply around 2035, 2036, something like that. So that's the plan. The plan from our perspective is based on that. It cannot. Well, we've looked into whether you can accelerate it even further, but it's fair to say that both reservoir projects are nationally significant infrastructure projects. They fall under the kind of planning inspectorate regime. The Ofwat, the Environment Agency, and Drinking Water Inspectorate have formed this regulatory alliance for progressing infrastructure development, so RAPID, and the clue's in the name. The idea there is to push these major water infrastructure projects through the regulatory approvals process, both through price reviews and to support a kind of accelerated planning process too. So it feels as though that's probably as soon as major pieces of infrastructure like the reservoirs can be built. There's less earth movement for the Fens reservoir than there is for the South Links reservoir, which is why the Fens one would come on first. It's also, of course, needed in order to allow Cambridge Water and Anglian Water to step back from some of their current abstraction licenses from the groundwater sources. Why not more? It's simply because there isn't enough water. We could build the reservoirs, but there wouldn't be enough water within the environment to fill them. There's very detailed modelling about when and how the reservoirs would be filled. They would be filled during the winter months when there is excess flows. They wouldn't be filled during the summer months. There would be hands-off flow conditions attached to the abstraction licenses. And so there just isn't enough water elsewhere within the region to fill a major reservoir such as those two. Desalination, you know, I understand people's concerns about desalination. It's probably fair to say the least favoured option when it comes to talking to customers about where they would like to see their water come from. But because of the paucity of other options, you cannot achieve the environmental returns without at least some desal within the mix. Let's remember that by 2035, the government has a goal to completely decarbonise the electricity grid. So we're not talking about more fossil fuels, you know, unabated fossil fuels at least being burnt in order to power desalination. We've also got massive expansion in offshore wind in particular, as well as new nuclear. And therefore we see that there could be really quite interesting, I suppose, combinations of offshore wind projects powering desal plant when there's an excess of wind, there's an excess electricity. Why not use that to create, you know, clean drinking water when essentially there is a surplus of clean energy? And of course, by then we can expect further developments in the technology to make it less energy intensive and to support some of the environmental concerns about getting that brine water out to sea. I'll leave it there, Richard, for now. But yeah, there are lots of other questions I could answer.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you for that, Daniel. I thought I might ask you both this next question. So feel free, perhaps Chris, you could go first and then Daniel second this time. Questions around public engagement. You know, a lot of this depends on demand management. How well do we feel that we're getting that message across at the moment to consumers? Are we getting across a sense of the scale of what needs to be done and the implications for us as individuals, and what more needs to be done? I mean, we've talked a lot in the past about sort of nudge techniques of getting people to sort of do things, but do we need to be a bit more draconian now? Do we need more compulsion? Where does Anglian Water sit on that, Chris? And what about from your point of view, WRE, Daniel?
It's not an area that I know a huge amount about in the business, but I think that my sense is this year, and talking to stakeholders like those on the call today out in the wild, there's this sort of a tightrope to walk, which is sort of reassuring customers that we're doing what we can to provide them with a source of water, but still reminding them of the need to be water efficient at all times. And when it starts raining, when we get into winter, people still need to be water efficient. It needs to be a business as usual approach from customers. And I think we probably need to personally up the ante on water efficiency messaging and do more and more on it where we can. And I think what's happened, particularly post-pandemic, with the increase in environmental concern that we've seen, we sort of need to rebalance those sorts of those sort of key messages and move people towards more do more messaging on water efficiency. I think it's very, very difficult. I think one thing we perhaps need to do more and more of is do it in partnership with others. Because I think there are sort of local organisations that could help convey messages and talk to their communities more effectively than we can. So we probably good at certain message routes, whereas actually if we do it in partnership with stakeholder organisations, we're probably more effective at the local level. So I definitely think there's more to do there, Richard.
Thank you. Daniel, any thoughts on that?
Well, just from our perspective, demand side action is, say, the first best answer to resolving these water shortages. As I think, was it Richard?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry. One of the questions was about, are we doing enough? Will it be successful? What's going to be new? So all the water companies in the east of England are going to be rolling out smart meters. Anglian Water first, so by 2030, Cambridge Water by 2035. others by 2040. And I think that's a real game changer, because what that does, first of all, is spot leakage, wastage within customers' properties, so that the companies can get on the phone to the customer and say, you've probably got a leaking toilet, you've probably got a leaking supply pipe. It's a relatively simple fix, and that could save you hundreds of litres of water per day. Our plan is based on overall per capita consumption, which is, I think, Sue James's question at the beginning, reducing from about 135 litres per person per day now to about 110 litres per person per day in 2050. And that's partly smart metering. It's partly about government policy, actually, as well. So the government is on the hook for at least some of this through revising building regulations to make new homes more water efficient. And I can see there's a question about water neutrality in the chat, which we can talk about, and also about product standards and water efficiency labels on taps, showers, and white goods like dishwashers and washing machines. And between those kinds of policies, we think we can save about 10 litres per person per day of water. And most of those savings will be, just completely invisible to customers. It's not reliant on customer behaviour change. It's not reliant on some of the nudge things you were talking about, which work very effectively, but aren't necessarily sustained unless you keep that kind of behavioural kind of response to that nudge going. So certainly, what's in the plan is mainly about things that we can kind of fit and forget, things which are do once and have that impact and have lasting, kind of sustained benefit in terms of per capita consumption.
Thank you for that. Let's just turn then, actually, I think it's a specific question, as you would absolutely expect, and I think it's probably, again, more for you, Daniel, than Chris, but I may be wrong on this, around what is the ambition for the chalk streams now? It's not good enough, I think we're hearing quite clearly in the chat, and I think most of us would agree, to say no further deterioration. We actually want them back to where they need to be in terms of their health.
Yeah.
What is the position on that, please, Daniel? So
yes, it's from Stephen, isn't it, and Elizabeth as well, saying no deterioration isn't enough. Clearly we are over abstracting from chalk aquifers, and that needs to change. And that's what the plan is being driven by. So if you saw the kind of jaws of death chart where demand is going up and the available supply is going down, that is primarily being driven not just about no deterioration, which is the kind of short-term pressure on companies, but in the longer term is about returning good ecological flows to every water body in the whole of the east of England. And that's why you need so much water by 2040. It's why you need major reservoirs. It's why you need desal. And just to be clear, again, the WRE board endorsed the very highest standards for environmental flows and returning water to nature. So what that would do, particularly for chalk streams, is meets not just the kind of environmental flow requirements, but there's a higher standard, the CSMG standards for chalk streams, headwaters, and for wetlands as well. So again, in the plan is baked in as returning as much water to nature as possible to achieve both the good ecological flows and those higher standards for chalk rivers and other designated habitats, and to do that as soon as possible.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Chris, I don't know how that one applies to you. I'm not sure it's your catchment, is it? But any thoughts on that one?
Sorry, Richard, I was busy reading the messages to try and reply to them. What was the question?
Chalk streams.
So we're doing a lot of the chalk stream investment that is coming through for the next AMP will be defined once the WINET, I should explain the WINET, the Water Industry National Environment Plan, which is the water company's environmental investment that we're working on right now. There's going to be obviously a lot of relevance to chalk streams across our region there. So where we're abstracting, there are license changes that are happening. So over further in the east into Suffolk, there's river restoration on chalk streams that we're doing as well. And then there's the flagship work across the country with chalk streams. So looking at the River Lark in Suffolk there. In Cambridgeshire, obviously that's Cambridge Water on the abstraction side, and we're on the water recycling quality side. And so we'll know in early in the new year what investment is likely to be happening and where, and which ones are on chalk streams. Interestingly, at the moment, the chalk streams do not have special status under the Water Framework Directive that allows us to preferentially invest in chalk streams. They probably should, because they're so unique and they're so important. but that at the moment doesn't exist. That might well change, and we would support it to change. So we'd be very happy to see changes in regulations that preferences investment in short streams because of the unique habitat, but that isn't there at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I've just got a very specific question that's relevant to the current discussion from Matthew Bullock. Are we going to see Cambridge Water more closely involved with Anglian Water's plans? It's an obvious gap in performance for such an important part of the county. Chris, Daniel, anything on that?
Yeah, well, just to say that that's exactly what that transfer is, the interim transfer between Grafham Water and Cambridge Water. That is clearly, a benefit of regional planning, which shows how taking a regional approach unlocks those kinds of opportunities, as opposed to what's happened in the past, which has been individual water companies planning for their own purposes, using their own assets and their own investments. I think it's also worth picking up one of the other questions about, can we accelerate some of these schemes? And actually both companies, Anglian and Cambridge, have put forward that scheme to DEFRA for a call that they put out in response to the recent drought events, exactly about how can you accelerate some of the infrastructure investments. And that scheme could be brought forward to the late 2020s rather than the early 2030s as a result of that investment, if it is approved by DEFRA.
Okay, thank you. Chris, there are a number of questions around tree planting for you and how you guarantee that the tree planting works. It's about healthy trees, not just about sticks in the ground.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't really like to talk about tree planting so much as sort of habitat creation, woodland creation, and so on. Now, a lot of the tree planting, woodland creation commitments that we got, we'll be doing on our own land, so we will be responsible for it, and we'll certainly have plans in place to ensure that whatever woodland we create gets established. I'm very interested in natural regeneration as well. At Grafham, there's a couple of blocks of land between two woodlands where you would expect local sources of seed would mean that natural regeneration would work, and that's probably going to be more effective in that scenario as well. So I'm quite happy and content that we'll have plans in place and the funding is built in for long-term maintenance and establishment of those woodlands. Obviously, it's critical that we plant the right tree in the right place. Lots of horror stories about doing the wrong thing by just willy-nilly putting trees anywhere without respecting the existing environment and things like that. So we've got to get that right. I'm very interested to hear from any sort of expert stakeholders and tree design action group here on what we should be planting where. Very happy to have those sorts of conversations as well. But as I say, if there are tree planting proposals as part of Natural Cambridgeshire's ambitions around the region, particularly in drinking water catchments, then I'd be really interested to hear from it if there's an opportunity for that to play into our reduction of our carbon footprint too.
Thank you. I think what we might come on to now is questions around water neutrality and whether or not that should be part of our framework in Cambridgeshire. Is that something you've looked at, Daniel and Chris, or is it something that we need to look to Justin and Natural England too as well in terms of their views on that?
Well, it's certainly worth talking to Natural England. We've not assumed any further rollout of water neutrality within the plan. We've based
Perhaps, it. Daniel, for the rest of the audience, what is water neutrality first? I'm sure most people know, but let's just make sure.
No, indeed. So, water neutrality is the concept where that regardless of the level of housing growth, the same amount of water, no more, no less, is taken out of the aquifer after the development as it was before. So importantly, first of all, the housing development should minimise its own water needs, and then any additional consumption of drinking water would then need to be offset by reductions and water efficiency programs in local housing associations, schools, hospitals, public buildings, so that overall you have no net increase in water consumption, which is a really important and powerful concept. And as one of your questions asked, yes, it has been rolled out in North Sussex. So all eyes are on North Sussex at the moment to see how that water neutrality kind of proposal that has been brought in by Natural England because of the state of the local aquifer could be rolled out. And to be honest, I think Cambridgeshire, as well as parts of Norfolk, could well be ripe for water neutrality emerging next. I've no particular intel on that, but if you would think about where in the region would water neutrality, where it might be needed, then Cambridgeshire would be high up on that list. Okay. So we've not planned on it being rolled out. I think it's an important concept, and is almost a signal, a sign that government policy on building regulations has failed to the extent that aquifers are so badly depleted that water neutrality, which is quite a blunt instrument, does need to be imposed. So it's not as if we would support water neutrality, because it is quite a blunt imposition, but it is a very clear signal that government policy on water efficiency in new homes has utterly failed.
Thank you for that. Chris, just coming back to you, there's a specific question here, which I think that came from part of your presentation around nature-based solutions for storm overflows. Is that something you can tell us a little bit more about?
Yeah, so again, not something I've been directly involved in, but storm overflow operates during extreme rainfall and discharges into rivers. But occasionally there might be an opportunity to discharge a storm overflow into a receiving wetland, which can provide a very modest but non-zero amount of biodiversity benefit. You know, it could be in a scenario, for example, that it's dry most of the time, apart from when a storm overflow operates, for example, and that wetland, if it's better than what land use it was before, would develop a degree of biodiversity value, and it could be designed so that it could actually create quite a bit of biodiversity value if we're clever about it. So that's one thing that we can do. Another thing at the other end, of course, is really we should be stopping rainfall getting into the sewers in the first place. That's what we should be doing, and there are potentially green solutions for that. Obviously, sustainable drainage systems, green roofs and things like that, all of those will deliver a biodiversity benefit too. So we're looking at that to see whether there's anything that's available, and Norfolk Rivers Trust, who we partner up a lot of work with in Norfolk, has suggested trying this in their patch as well. So before long, maybe we'll have an actual example that we can look at and just see how well it works. But it would be great to find a way of incorporating nature into the storm overflow problem if we can.
Lovely. Thank you, Chris. I'm conscious we're coming up to sort of the need to close this session. There was a question about conflicts of interest that Wendy had raised. Daniel and Chris, perhaps you could just address that offline if you don't mind. I think it's important. I wasn't aware of the issue. It's in the chat. And also question about the update on the current Ofwat investigation and whether enough is being done to invest in leakage as well. Anything you'd like to add on that? Chris first, and then you're on mute, Daniel. Okay.
I'm not sure which investigation that you're applying to.
So I've got a question from Wendy. Update on Ofwat investigation, please. As Paul Leinster said, wastewater was one of the biggest issues, regrowth. Also, what's happening about addressing leaks and ancient pipes? Is that one for you, Chris, or for Daniel?
Well, so there's one Ofwat investigation that I'm aware of, which is about what's called full flow treatment, where water recycling centres have to be big enough to take a certain amount of flow before there's diversion to storm tanks and into potentially then into the river untreated. That investigation is still in play. I don't know what status it is at, but Wendy, I can email someone and try and get an update from you. I think what I can do is just reassure people, though, that we expect to for that investigation to be completed and for nothing to be seen here from an Anglian Water perspective is my understanding of it. But we'll need to wait and see what the investigation delivers. So Wendy, let me take an action to email someone internally, and I'll just give you a more accurate update from someone who can provide it.
Thank you, Chris. Anything further from you, Daniel?
Just say that Water Resources East is independent of Anglian Water, Cambridgeshire Water, or any other water company. So we're not involved in the investigation. I have no more information than anybody else on what the latest is. But yeah, one of the kind of common claims that often gets levied against Water Resources East is we're some kind of we're just controlled, we're owned by the water companies. Just that's simply not true. Water companies only have 4 out of 14 seats on our board. They are our primary funder, but that gets then channeled through an investment committee. And obviously Water Resources East itself is chaired by Paul Leinster as an independent chair. So yeah, independent, not-for-profit organisation, not controlled or owned by the water companies.
Very good. Lovely. Very fruitful discussion, lots of questions. Apologies if I didn't get around to every question. I will encourage Daniel and Chris just to have a quick look through, and perhaps if there are anything that can be dealt with either in the chat or offline by email, that would be good if we could. So we're halfway through the session. We've got 2 speakers left. I've got with me Justin and then Megan from Fenland Soil. So what I'm hoping is that each of them will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll take some questions again for about 15 minutes, and then we'll round up with the AGM. Now, I'm just going to look at my agenda, which tells me it's you next, Justin. So good to see you, and look forward to hearing from you about the work of Natural England.
Super. Thanks, Richard. And thanks for having me on this call today. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Justin Tilley. I'm a manager within the West Anglia team of Natural England. So this is a team that covers our frontline delivery across the counties of Cambridgeshire, Northants, Bedfordshire, Essex and Hertfordshire. So I don't know whether, yeah, there we are. So thanks, Helen. Hopefully you can all see that. I've got a short slide pack to help us through this. So if we go to the next slide, please, Helen.
Apologies, don't know what's happened here. Thought I had 4 slides up, Justin, bear with.
That's okay. I'll just give you a bit for those. So I'm going to be sort of running through our local delivery, but just as a bit of background, Natural England is obviously a government, semi-government agency where we advise on issues around the natural environment. So we've got a vision of sort of looking at how we provide this ambition of thriving nature for people and planet. So our ambition is not just to improve nature, but see it thriving everywhere. And part of that is around that recognition that a healthy natural environment is really sort of fundamental to people's health, wealth, happiness, and part of what we value as a country. So in terms of thinking of nature, you know, this is, we think about wildlife, we think about biodiversity, but really it's about, we also look at sort of natural beauty and landscapes. Thanks, Helen. We're also looking at how how our geological interests play into this, both the everything that's underneath our feet, our landforms that we have across England, and also looking at our cultural connections with nature as well. So it's really important thinking about those other ways that people view and appreciate nature. We very much value working in partnership. There's very little that we do on our own. It's something we really need to think about how we work with the widest range of people possible. So this goes right through from environmental NGOs, statutory agencies, right down to local communities and individuals who are out there actually carrying out work on the ground. So and the other side of it, as well as the partnerships, it's looking at that really large scale ecosystem approach. So a lot of what we do as Natural England is aligned to the government's 25-year environment plan. So we've sort of brigaded this around these 4 sort of key goals that are sort of highlighted on this slide. We want to see that resilience in our landscapes and seas across the country. We want to see genuinely sustainable development where it comes forward. We want to see greener policies around farming and fisheries for both the environment's sake, but also for that sort of sustainability in that sector. And also a really important goal that threads through all of these other ambitions is the idea around how we help people better connect with nature for both their own well-being and educational aims, but also so that more people can appreciate what we have and look for ways to interact with it. Next slide, please, Helen. So one of the first things I was just going to run through, I've cut off the and seas section of this ambition for Cambridgeshire, but resilient landscapes, you know, this is really sort of building on those Lawton principles that we described, we heard Chris refer to earlier. The idea of bigger, better, more, and joined up. At the heart of this is our protected areas. So if we're thinking about the protected sites that we see within Cambridgeshire, we've got a range of different landscapes that hold very important habitats and species that are protected as sites of special scientific interest, and also national nature reserves, both of which are the sites of special scientific interest being the underpinning designated areas. We also have those European sites, the special protected areas, which are important for their bird life, and also the special areas of conservation and Ramsar sites as well, which cover other flora and fauna that are particularly of European quality in terms of the context here. So sites like the Ouse Washes spring to mind as a site where, you know, we think about the bird life, but we also know that there's very important habitats there that are underpinned in that special area of conservation, and also the Ramsar interest for the wetland elements. So in terms of protected sites work, we, you know, one of our core roles is around looking at how we achieve favourable condition within these areas, and we do that by provision of technical advice to land managers, and also a regulatory role where we provide permission or advise on certain ways to carry out operations within the boundaries of those sites, so to ensure that they remain or achieve favourable condition. Underpinning this is very much an evidence base where we look to carry out monitoring to guide us in terms of what we want to see on those sites, look at how populations of key species are faring, or the condition of those habitat assemblages that are really important. And we can follow up with elements around funding through environmental stewardship or other mechanisms to enhance those areas. Other really important protected areas are our national nature reserves, both in many of these are managed by Natural England in the Cambridgeshire context. Natural England manage a range of sites in the Fens, so Woodwalton Fen and Home Fen, also Monkswood, and also up in the sort of Peterborough landscape where we manage the Barnet Hills and Holes and Castor Hanglands. And this is where we can deliver best practice nature conservation, carry out research and scientific investigations, and also look at how we interact with people, provide opportunities for engagement on those sites. But of course, protected areas only get us so far, which is why the creation of the Nature Recovery Network is so important. And this is the concept of having a single joined up network of important wildlife sites across the country, looking at enhancing what we have, developing stepping stones in between those areas, and also how we join them up. So, and a key element of that is the development of local nature recovery strategies. So Natural England has a really key role here in terms of supporting responsible authorities to create these strategies over the coming years. This will be a spatial framework that sets out a map around the key areas and where that focus of energy and input will go to best effect, and it will define what the ambition is of the local area, both those communities and also the other stakeholders within that part of the country. These will be county-based, so Cambridgeshire will be having one. My colleague Caroline Noble, who's on the call, acts as a senior advisor on our behalf for this, and we'll be working with stakeholders to develop those strategies when the guidance comes out. Hopefully April next year is when a lot of that will kick off. Next slide, please, Helen. So greener farming is a really important part of our work as well. So a lot of this is quite, again, in a similar manner to thinking about protected sites. You know, we've carried out a lot of this over many years, giving farm advice, provision of stewardship to help fund beneficial works in the farmed environment, and sort of giving guidance to help farmers in terms of thinking about how to be more efficient and effective in terms of managing nutrients, so nutrient inputs, catchment sensitive farming approach, how we prevent those valuable sort of inputs getting into the watercourses and being costly measures that having to extract nutrients, phosphates and nitrogen from the drinking water, but also the environmental impact it has. And also looking at how we protect the soil resource. Prevention of erosion is such an important thing with regards to how we keep soil health in good condition. So obviously environmental stewardship and countryside stewardship have been part of those schemes that have come forward through our sort of European-wide ambition under the Common Agricultural Policy. We're now looking at how the future looks in terms of environmental land management schemes, which are coming forward in a number of ways. Most exciting is the concept of the landscape recovery approach, where it really does look at a wide-scale partnerships between different landowners in an area who come together to set their own ambition about what they want to see. We've seen, and I think that will really help to drive the local nature recovery strategies will help to drive that in terms of targeting particular areas where that ambition can be realised. And it'll be a way to really sort of change how we approach farming in this country in some areas, where balancing it between that really important resource for food production, but also looking at how we drive nature recovery across the vast swathes of our landscape. I've included the lowland peat strategy there. Obviously, the Cambridgeshire Fens is an absolutely vital area in terms of getting a bit of echo. Hopefully you can't hear that. Lowland peatland strategy is so important.
Can I just ask, make sure everybody's on mute, because I think that could be making the echo happen.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, hopefully. I think that's gone now, hopefully. So the lowland peat strategy, obviously across Cambridgeshire, again, such an important resource, such an important element of what we're doing in terms of looking at how we adapt to climate change and prevent CO2 emissions. And we're heavily involved with guiding and assisting with the discovery grants in the area. So we're looking at particularly the Fens East Peat Partnership, which again links into the National Nature Reserves up at Home Fen particularly, and Chippenham Fen as well, and also looking at supporting Fenland soils work, which we'll hear about later. But this, and a lot of work going on in terms of our partnership with the Great Fen, thinking about paludiculture and the future of how wet farming could be a realistic aim within our part of the world. Could I have the next slide, please, Helen? Sustainable development is another really important part of our remit. So we provide advice to local authorities on planning applications, looking at how those developments might impact the environment, particularly around protected areas, and thinking about how that can be avoided, mitigated, or potentially compensated for. This is a remit that we've had. We also look at protected species as well. District level licensing is operating within Cambridgeshire, so thinking about great crested newts and how we can help to facilitate development in the right place, but also have that gain for the environment as well. As well as planning applications, we are also looking at sort of the strategic planning side of things, and in fact investing more time and effort in that forward planning process, so that we get really good policies within local plan documents that mean that both developers, the local authority and communities know what to expect from development coming forward, making sure it's as best as possible in the right places, and also sort of having that interaction with knowing where the benefits can come from, some of the funding that comes from development, and investing that within the natural environment. Nationally significant infrastructure proposals are as referenced previously on some of these major projects that go forward, that go through the planning inspector process and Secretary of State approval. These are things such as road schemes. Fenland Reservoir will be part of that. And we guide upon that and help to make that decision-making process work for the natural environment as well. Water is such a key driver in terms of what we do within Cambridgeshire. You know, the paucity of water that we have, the challenges in terms of growth upon the aquifers and wetland habitats that we have, but also looking at how to prevent pollution incidents into our watercourses and standing water areas. So we've recently appointed a senior advisor within our team to help us with the capacity for that. And a lot of we're investing increasing amounts in terms of guiding local authorities, working really closely with the Environment Agency and looking at how we interact with water companies, Anglian Water and Cambridgeshire Water in this part of the world.
Justin, I've got about a minute and a half left for you, sorry.
Okay, that's all right. There
you go.
I'm nearly on the final slide.
That's
Biodiversity net gain is a key area as well, but we will no doubt come back to that in more depth at another stage. So just a final slide, just to briefly canter through as well. There's a lot around underpinning all of this is connecting people with nature elements. So looking at how we improve green infrastructure provision, looking at how we link in with health providers around encouraging volunteering and green social prescribing, and looking at how we reach out to other communities that perhaps have been less well served by the natural environment sector in the past. So thinking about diversifying our both social and ethnic groups that can interact and feel welcome in the wider rural area, and within those feeling safe and welcomed within urban natural green spaces as well. So that's a really brief run through such a wide remit, and I'll be happy to take questions. I think.
Thank you, Justin. That's a great remit, and what a busy agenda, and I think in many ways a hopeful agenda if we can get those policies embedded and delivered. What I'm going to do, though, as I said, is I'm going to ask Megan to do her presentation now, and then we'll bring the questions together for a final session before we do the AGM. Megan, can I ask you as well to try and keep to the 15 minutes so that we've got time for a few questions?
Yeah, I'll try my best.
Well, thank you very much. And has Helen got your slides, or have you got some slides?
Helen's got my slides.
Lovely.
Hopefully.
Thank you.
I have got them. Let me just find them because I had to close them down because they came up when I was trying to
no worries. I'll try and do a bit of an introduction whilst you're finding those.
Thank you.
So I must apologise for a start for the heavy cold I've got. So if you pick up any sniffs or sneezes throughout this presentation, I do apologise. I'm Megan Hudson. I'm the General Manager of Fenland Soil. Fenland Soil is a not-for-profit multi-stakeholder group which is working for farmers in the Cambridgeshire Fens and beyond into bits of Lincolnshire, Suffolk and Norfolk as well. And we're made up of farmers' conservation teams. So we've got people like the National Trust, the RSPB, wildlife trusts, loads of different academics, so we're represented by teams at Cranfield, UKCEH, Leicester and Cambridge, and other local players that are really key to the whole peatland debate. And our aim is really to inform and develop whole farm land use policies aimed at mitigating climate change and biodiversity enhancement in the Fens, and to establish an agreed set of numbers for greenhouse gas emissions from deep, shallow and wasted peat soils, as well as assisting with mapping. Next slide, please. So obviously the major thing that we set out to really tackle is peat loss, and I'm sure I don't need to go into too much detail about this because I'm sure a lot of people on the call will be aware. But obviously over time in the Fens we've seen significant loss of our peat soils through a combination of sort of physical shrinkage of our soils, but also due to the soil itself being oxidised or physically blown away in our fen blows. So in the photo there on the left shows home post, which I'm sure again many of you will have seen, but in the mid 1800s, a post was buried at home fence. So the top was level with the soil surface, and today that post, with me there for scale, is 4 meters above the soil surface, which really shows the dramatic shrinkage that we've seen in the fens in places. And in addition to all of this, kind of whilst we're oxidizing these soils and they're being kind of oxidized away, that oxidation is releases a massive amount of carbon emissions, which is a major barrier to the farming industry reaching its net zero ambitions. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more in depth about these soil carbon emissions. So estimates suggest that agricultural land use on the Cambridgeshire Fens is currently producing about 2.6 million tonnes of CO2 per year. And the focus is generally in the past been on our peat soils, but all of our high organic matter soils in the Fens, of which there are many, are emitting. And we're looking at figures, and these figures are Fenland Soil's own ones from our first year data from our flux towers. And there's also kind of existing work that's been done by UKCH, which these numbers generally align with, of 30 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year from our deep peat soils, and about 12 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year from our skirter fen soils, which is not an insignificant number. And it's obviously a major challenge that we're starting to look at addressing. The graph on this slide shows some of the additional work that's been done in the area, looking at the relationship between emissions and water table depth. And you can see we'll focus on the black line because that's kind of the net greenhouse gas balance. There's a sweet spot at around 10 centimetres below the soil surface there, where we achieve the sort of the minimum levels of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's really the sweet spot that ideally we'd like to hit in terms of achieving maximum greenhouse gas mitigations. But as you can imagine, that having a water table just 10 centimetres below the soil surface isn't really realistic in terms of being able to then still farm it. So that presents a major challenge, and obviously it's something that we need to address. Next slide, please. So all of these emissions really kind of came to importance and really became relevant when the 6th carbon budget was released in 2020. So, and the key bit of this really is that bit that's in the red box there. So by 2035, we're looking at 47% of peat being restored, and 79% by 2050. And by 2050, we're also looking at 60% of lowland peat to be re-wetted or under sustainable management. And what that really means for us is looking at that water table management and a raised water table, and it would be a pretty major change to the way things are cropped in the Fens currently. Next slide, please. So kind of looking at all of that evidence and kind of the scary figures that we've got for greenhouse gas emissions, you might be kind of looking at that thinking, well, why don't we just re-wet everything? Why are we bothering? And kind of this is the reason why it's all a little bit more complicated. So if we look at these facts and stats, they're actually from the National Farmers Union. The Fens is really agriculturally productive. So 7% of the UK's food is produced on just 4% of its land area. And that's the land area of England. So it's kind of a really overly productive area for the size of it. A third of the UK's fresh produce is produced here in the Fens. Our agricultural supply chain is currently employing about 80,000 people, which is equivalent to the population of the entirety of Peterborough. So a really significant amount of jobs that are being produced, that are being created through this industry. And 88% of the land here is cultivated, and the majority of grade 1 and grade land 2 is here as well. So the Fens is really economically important, particularly to the farming industry, and it adds this layer of complexity when we're thinking about how we can mitigate these emissions and still meet challenges such as food security and employment in an area that really needs it. Next slide, please. So that's kind of covered the background. So we can talk a little bit more about what Fenland Soil is actually doing now. So Fenland Soil, you might have noticed, is actually an acronym, and our acronym stands for Sustainability, Opportunities, Innovation and Learning. And our kind of aims as an organisation are built around those 4 pillars. So we're aiming to inform and develop these whole farm land policies to mitigate climate change, including encouraging nature-friendly and regenerative practices and enhancing biodiversity. We're going to use a bottom-up approach to generate opportunities for positive change to policy, to create new opportunities for farmers and really allow a dialogue between them and those that are making decisions. We're helping to find new approaches and techniques that allow the continuation of farming while still mitigating emissions, so finding that compromise and finding that balance. And we're hoping to help establish agreed figures for greenhouse gas emissions from deep, shallow and wasted peat, improve mapping and facilitate those discussions and changes. So that's what we're aiming to do. How are we doing it? So next slide, please, Helen. So the committee itself is organised into 5 work streams. So I'm going to talk you through now a little bit about what each work stream is actually doing. So our first one is our Farmers Dialogue work stream, which is hosted by which is led by Nicole Press, who is one of the local farming champions for the Lowland Agricultural Peat Task Force. And this work stream really is about kind of encouraging dialogue between farmers, getting everybody together, encouraging industry to be having those conversations with farmers, and really about meeting the challenges as a group and with a collective voice, rather than kind of everybody plugging away and doing their separate things. So as part of the work that this work stream's been doing this year, we hosted our inaugural Farmers Dialogue event at FC Palmer and Sons and Streatham in June, and we were really pleased to see over 65 different people from 45 different organisations at that event. So that was really positive, and we were getting conversations starting to happen between people that wouldn't normally talk to each other. So all of that was really positive. And our following event, Water for the Future at Ben Burgess, was equally successful, and we saw speakers from Anglian Water, the NFU, and some from Fenland soil itself. So that work stream's been really positive, and yeah, there'll be some more work to follow there. Next slide, please. So the next work stream that we've got is our greenhouse gas emissions work stream. That's led by Chris Evans at UKCEH, and we're working with UKCEH and building on their existing work that they've been doing in the Fens for the last sort of decade, and also working with Quantera, which is a new organisation, to provide more data to go with the work that's already been done. So we're enhancing that data set there in the Fens. We now have 5 flux tower units that we funded as Fenland soil across the Fens. So the map on there shows you roughly where they all are. And those flux towers are across a range of different crops and soil types, which really allows us to kind of get a bit more of an idea of what's going on. And we'll start testing some mitigations through there as well, and seeing what the impact is of different mitigations and what carbon savings we could potentially be seeing. Next slide, please. So the third work stream that we're looking at is our landscape mapping one, which is headed up by Ian Holman at Cranfield. The majority of our landscape mapping work at the moment is actually being done by our Natural England Peatland Restoration Discovery Grant project, as was mentioned in the previous presentation. We're as part of our project, we're kind of taking a slightly different tack from a lot of the different Discovery Grant projects, and we're looking at intensively mapping soils to field scale within the 3 internal drainage board areas that we're looking at within the Fens, using farmers' local expert knowledge, as well as a load of other different maps that we're creating. So the end product of our Discovery Grant project will be our landscape management opportunity maps for each internal drainage board, which will integrate a mosaic, or as it may not stay static over time, kaleidoscope of different management practices, which we use as a tool by land managers to designate changes that they could potentially make to their farm to maximise their carbon savings. Next slide, please. So just so everybody's aware of where we're working at, these are the 3 internal drainage boards that we're looking at within the Fens. So we've got Mainey and Welney, Burnt Fen and Paddle and Waterton IDBs. But again, I'm rushing through this, so if there's any further questions afterwards, please do let me know. Next slide, please, Helen. And the way that we're actually going about this is we're using a load of existing data. So we've got Farmers Lexicon pilot project, which was completed by Fenland Soil in 2020. Existing IDBs, waterways maps, IDB biodiversity action plans, existing biodiversity data, satellite imagery, etc., to kind of create some baseline maps. And then we're using some further data that we're kind of pulling together to create these 4 new mapping layers. So we've got peat, condition and depth, which really does what it says on the tin. It's telling us exactly what soils we've got where, some info about how deep they are, and really giving us an idea of what condition they're in. We've got yield and productivity maps, which we've created with help from farmers, which is helping us identify where the kind of most productive areas of soil are, are within the Fens, and allowing us to target restoration to those that are less productive and sustainably intensify elsewhere. Water management data, so we know where we've got water availability to actually do different types of restoration, and we can tailor management practices to where we've got the water to do them. And then biodiversity mapping, so making sure that we can exploit natural hotspots in biodiversity, and kind of make sure that we're working with nature rather than against it on the land management practices that we're putting into place. And we'll pull all of those together, see how those layers interact with each other, and then assign different land management practices and create these land management opportunity maps based on how those layers interact. with a view to then go forward for restoration grant applications or to put some of the land into different projects and basically test some of those mitigations out and see how they fare up. So that was all kind of a whistle stop tour. If we go on to the next slide, we'll be able to see kind of roughly what we're looking at. So this is roughly what a simplified version of what the discovery grant maps will look like. So there will be different practices that will slot into place across the landscape, and those might move around over time. So it might be appropriate to move those and actually have some slight variation depending on cropping and on what's going on in the rest of the IDB. So that's just a little bit of an idea of what it might look like. Next slide, please. So that brings us on to our nature-based systems workstream, which has been working closely with that project as well. We've hosted a couple of biodiversity action days at Wycombe Fen, with support from the National Trust and with the Centre for Landscape Regeneration at Cambridge, to basically open farmers' eyes up to what opportunities they've got on farm to enhance biodiversity and get them thinking about their farm in a different way. So those were really successful. We saw pretty high attendance on those, and managed to get the guys out doing some pond dipping and actually investigating what might be hiding in their ditches as well, which was really positive. And they've left with lots more ideas on what they could be doing on farm to change things. So we're really making sure by having that work stream that we're not siloing farming and nature as two separate things, but making sure they're integrating and working together. So next slide, please. And so that brings us on to our final work stream, which is our economic and social impacts work stream. The bulk of the work this year that's been going on within that work stream is our economic analysis project. So we commissioned Anderson's Easton to carry out farm scale economic analysis for 10 farms in the Fens. And that allows us really to determine whether mitigations are economically viable, and what incentives farmers may need to implement different mitigation methods to reduce their carbon emissions. There aren't any kind of results from that report yet because it won't be completed until spring 2023, but we're starting the early stages of working out what's actually possible, which is really positive. Next slide, please. So I've kind of run through all of that extremely quickly because I'm quite conscious on time, but in terms of next steps, we'll be producing a vision for the future from each of our other work streams. So there is already one existing for our farmers dialogue, which if you get in touch with me, if you're interested, I can send across to you. We've got a completion of the Discovery Grant project and subsequent report, and also our Anderson's project. The Farmers Dialogue group is continuing to expand, so we're constantly seeing different members from across the Fens getting in touch and wanting to kind of get involved in the conversation and in the debate. We're continuing to build up relationships with the other groups that are working in the area, so making sure that there's no kind of duplication of work and that we're really working collaboratively with other projects. We're assisting with the production of new soil maps, and we're continuing to produce these updated emissions factors and find out what the results are of different mitigations. So thank you. That brings us on to our final slide, where I would just like to thank all the different organisations that have been supporting Fenland all over the past year, and open it up to any questions. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much indeed, Megan, for that really helpful sort of presentation. And sorry to make you rush through it a little bit, but thank you. It's very, very helpful. I'm going to turn to a few questions then. We've had some questions in the chat. I'm going to start off with one for you, Justin, that Vince Lee has posted, which I think is really interesting, around, very sadly, the number of species that become extinct in Cambridgeshire over either the historic past, like the great bustard, or indeed in the more recent past, things like the willow tit, and I think very shortly things like lesser spotted woodpecker and potentially even turtle dove. Does Natural England have a plan to stop local extinctions or to encourage recolonisation? And Vince has posed the question there, could this be one part of our measurement for how successful we are in doubling nature? Just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a particular challenge. A lot of the way that conservation has been done in recent years has been around looking at habitats. These are things where we can sort of prepare for good habitats for those key species, but inevitably we're seeing those declines continue. I do know that what we will be looking at is a lot more emphasis on species recovery and looking at the locally appropriate interventions to help those declining species come back. There'll be further funding coming for this from DEFRA in the coming year ahead, and we'll be inviting partners and coming to the LNP to look at what projects are within Cambridgeshire that we might want to investigate and might need some funding opportunities to help get off the ground. So in terms of a plan, it is something that's being developed. It's more of a national level thing rather than at a local level, but we will be looking to work with those partners as part of the nature recovery agenda to really sort of drive forward that species work. So it'll be it's a work in progress, basically.
Yeah. And indeed, in many respects, embraces all the things we've spoken about today, the need to improve water quality, enhance wetlands, reduce the carbon emissions. All of it adds up, doesn't it? It's creating the habitats and the space for nature to flourish.
Yeah, indeed.
Megan, we've got a couple of questions in the chat for you. What would the impact, if the peatlands are, in the phrase that's used here, better cared for or re-wetted to some extent, what would be the impact on the amount of food produced? Have we modelled that at all?
Yeah, so I guess the short answer to that at the moment is that we don't really know. So it would depend on the level of kind of management that changes that are made. It kind of depends whether we go to kind of full re-wetting, what scale we go to full re-wetting, and all of those kind of different factors. But the hope is, and with the work that we're doing, is that we can minimise the impact that would have on food production, and basically make sure that we can kind of compromise and have both, and find ways that we can kind of continue to have the amount of food we need, at the same time as providing these carbon savings and also benefits to biodiversity and the environment as well.
Am I right in believing, though, that in actual fact there isn't a sort of, if we carried on, if no change was made, then the amount of food produced would also reduce because the amount of soil available and the quality of the soil would deteriorate? Is that true? I can see Matthew shaking his head. That's fine. I was asking the question.
That's a good question. The answer to that is I'm not actually sure. But I'm sure we can find out and get back to you on that one.
Matthew was shaking his head. Do you want to comment?
Well, unfortunately, as we reduce the amount of peat, you find actually that skirt fen, which is the stuff which is much thinner, tends to be more productive. So that's one of the issues, and that's all about it. But of course, and also this whole question of dealing with emissions, we've got to deal with at the same time as production of food. So these are very complex problems. But just to say an idea, there's only 8% we calculate of the fens is currently now deep peat. So 92% of the rest of the fens is by and large shallow or skirt. So we've got to consider you can't re-wet areas, and a lot of the fen can't be re-wetted because there's no means of doing that watering into clay-based subsoil.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Question from Pamela Abbott to you again, Megan. Field-based opportunity maps, will they look at connectivity across the landscape as well between potential new wetlands and existing nature-rich areas with new wetlands?
Yes, absolutely. So the project that we have been doing, we deliberately chose IDBs that didn't have existing sites in them. But when we're generating our biodiversity layer, we are kind of actively considering what's going on outside of those areas and how can we create those channels of connectivity throughout our new landscapes that we're creating. And basically make sure that we're integrating those in and creating stepping stones for nature throughout the landscape. So we are actively considering that and making sure that is included as part of the project.
Okay. Thank you. Question from Ian Hodge, which I think is probably a general one. I don't know whether it's something you can answer, Megan or Justin, or anybody else. Do we have any plans for carbon credits, to sell carbon credits from greenhouse gas emissions reduction locally? Are there any plans in place? Anyone thinking about that? Anybody want to answer that? Matthew again.
We've started to talk about this. At the moment, there's no properly accredited Fenland project that we could start selling through to corporates. So I had to have a conversation with the Golden Standard people who were really very poor coming back. So we need to find somebody who can come up with an accreditation process. I've heard of one farmer who is in fact using a company in the city, but to really get it serious, the investors into that, you've got to have accreditation. At the moment, that is not something we've managed to do.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you. I'm just trying to just quickly run through and see if there's any other questions for Megan or Justin.
Catherine Wakeman's got her hand up.
Has she? Okay, sorry, Catherine, do you want to go ahead? Thank you, Helen. I didn't see that. I think you must be on mute, Catherine. I can't hear you anyway. Oh, you had it a minute ago.
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
We can now, Catherine. Yes, hi, how are you?
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say quickly, yeah, it's a very complex field at the moment. I just noticed Hannah Phillips about the peatland code, but whether it's going to be updated, the version 2, but whether it's relevant for the lowland peat, I'm not sure. The jury's out yet, but it's so complex. There's lots of other things as well, carbon and Great Fen are looking at this. There's no sort of it's too complex at the moment. Sort of government hasn't really chosen one which way is best to go. So there's lots of options, but I think it's a bit of a mire for farmers and landowners to know what to do.
Thank you, Catherine.
But just on a reference, those who want to be interested in trying to understand what is happening in paludiculture, there is a conference in January, which we're having at CCI. We're looking in the detail possibility of paludiculture, but I have to say it is a very long shot at the moment. Okay,
thank you, Matthew. A question again from Pamela. The Lowland Peat Code coming soon. Anyone know anything more about that?
Yeah, it's the update of the peatland code. It's not a Pacific lowland code. Yeah. It's a version 2 of the peatland code, but we don't think it will really really cover what we need in the lowlands. We sort of wait maybe version 3, I don't know.
Yeah, so the update, I had a meeting about this a few weeks ago. So the update to the peatland code 2 is coming in January, and they are now including a section on lowland peat, but nobody in our team is yet to see that, so we've not kind of been part of any of the draft work or anything. I would suspect that it will be kind of more helpful for those in lowland raised bog areas for now, but we can kind of wait and see, and the jury's out on that one.
That discovery grant, which we've the 3 IDBs, is really important, and everybody should really understand that is the picture where we're trying to come up with a new code, and if we could get more support other IDB areas, then we have a methodology now which we use much more wisely.
Okay, thank you. Just one last question then, perhaps for both of you. How optimistic do you feel about the future? The multitude of grave challenges to our biodiversity and from peatland carbon emissions, but do you think we're on the right track? Are there reasons for optimism? Who wants to go first on that general question? Justin, go on, give us your views.
I think you've got to be optimistic, because otherwise it is too, this is why we're here. We are just to be on a call with 70, 80 odd people that want to make things better within Cambridgeshire across a huge range of different sectors. We've got a lot of new things we can use in terms of statutory measures. We're getting increasing amounts of research and evidence coming through to help underpin our decision making every day. So I think you've got to remain optimistic. The key thing is that we work together on it. And I think that this is the range of topics that have been covered this morning, right from sort of like climate agenda through to water usage, through to the biodiversity and nature recovery, the people side of things. Everything that we've talked about is so interwoven with each other that, and I think Cambridgeshire particularly is leading the way with a lot of this work. So I remain optimistic, and I hope that others do too.
Thank you. Megan, how are you?
Yeah. I feel like I can't really follow that answer, to be honest. Yeah, no, I agree. I think we've got a lot of reason to remain optimistic. There's so many people working on this area and working on this problem that I feel like there is kind of lots of cause to be really optimistic. Yeah, as Justin said, there's a lot of work going on in Cambridgeshire, and I think we really are leading the way in the UK with regards to the lowland peat work, which is something to be really proud of. And yeah, we can only carry on and see what the next sort of 2 or 3 years of research bring in and what opportunities that brings us.
Brilliant, and thank you both for all your hard work and effort. So we share your optimism and success. And I think, you know, your point, Justin, is, you know, this is a group of people on this call today who obviously all want this to happen. We want to change the paradigm really, and ensure, you know, particularly from Natural Cambridgeshire's point of view, that nature has a chance not just to recover a little bit, but to recover really well. I think we all dream of the days when actually we can see abundance of wildlife rather than paucity of wildlife, and that's good for nature, of course, and it's good for people and our way of life. So this final section really is just an opportunity to update you on Natural Cambridgeshire's work and also on our governance mechanisms. We do this once a year, just to update you on where we are on our trustee elections and our officer elections, but also take the opportunity to talk about our work in general. And what we've done this year, thanks particularly to Peter Lanshoff and Helen Dye for pulling together both a Natural Cambridgeshire activities and a sort of state of nature report, which I hope you'll all have received in advance of the meeting and had chance to read. Rather than go through all of that, I'm just going to offer a few highlights, and then, as I say, just touch on some of the governance things. And I think if you do read the report, you can see in my introduction that I kind of share in many ways Justin's view that it does feel like we really are on the cusp now of significant change. Perhaps, so I don't get accused of over-optimism, if we don't make that significant change, then we're on the cusp of disaster. I mean, the stats for nature and biodiversity in this country do not get any better, which is quite dispiriting when you consider about the amount of work that we've done collectively, many people over many generations over the years. But I think I read somewhere that at the moment, the index of abundance of our priority species is declining by 2% a year. Only 14% of our rivers are deemed to be in good condition, and only 38% of land that is currently protected for nature is actually in favourable condition. And it's when you read stats like that that you think, sort of, you know, the grandiose ambitions of 30 by 30, well, that's fine, but you know, we've got to make sure that what we've got is being protected, and we're not doing enough. So on the one hand, I think it can be very very depressing for people like us, you know, just even looking out of the windows and thinking just how few birds there are around and how many species seem to be in decline. It can be incredibly depressing. And when you consider the pressures of growth and human demands, that isn't always a recipe for optimism. But I do think that Justin's presentation was very helpful in outlining where the policy direction is. You know, there are some very significant policy changes either in place or about to come into place, which I think can drive forward the ambitions of nature recovery. There are legal targets to be in place. There seems to be an appetite within government to take things forward, not as fast as I would want, but perhaps faster than we dared to hope 10 years ago. So if those policies are implemented, and if I think particularly things like local nature recovery strategies, environmental land management schemes, biodiversity net gain payments, then there's this opportunity to shift the paradigm and to see much more nature in Cambridgeshire rather than less, and actually then to be able to move towards those doubling nature targets. So 2023 does seem to me to be a critical year. Perhaps they've all been critical for far too long, you know, but I think we would hope by the end of next year to really see some of that shift. And if not, then we have to reflect hard on where we're going. From Natural Cambridge's point of view, I think it has been a very busy and significant year for us. Not least the decision by the combined authority to put in place the £1 million fund for nature. The decision was taken in June, and we are at this moment, there's an assessment team looking at 11 expressions of interest for those landscape projects that we are hoping to offer matched funding towards, and to create a revolving fund for nature so that we can actually finance nature recovery rather than be continually wondering where the resources are going to come from. And we are looking at innovative ways in which that funding can be made, in that investment can be made, and in an effort to sort of stop that cycle of boom and bust projects and actually, you know, really ensure there's sustainable nature recovery across the county. Within the fund, there are two key elements: the landscape projects, which I've just mentioned, and we've already gone out, as I say, for expressions of interest on those. And there is also a significant amount of money for community grants and to help small, you know, local communities to make those their own steps on local nature recovery strategies, whether that's at community level, parish level, or whatever it may be, and we'll be rolling that out in the new year as well. So I think that's a very significant piece for us. Along with that came funding from the Combined Authority to help us expand our own team. So we now have Pamela Abbott as our Partnership Director, who joined us in September, working obviously with Helen, who continues as our Partnership Coordinator. So we've pretty much doubled our capacity, and that is significant because it enables us to get on and do far more on the doubling nature agenda. And the other thing I think, just to sort of pick out again and look forward to, is the local nature recovery strategy, which will be, you know, I think my understanding is that the latest guidance is that things will really kick off in April next year. But prior to that, there's an awful lot of work for us to do, I think, to plan how we take that forward, how we engage. There were a couple of questions on this in the chat, how we absolutely engage not only with farmers and landowners, but also with local public, both in rural areas and in urban areas. And I really hope that we can see local nature recovery strategy not as something that is a rather sort of bureaucratic document that you know, only local authorities ever refer to, but it is actually something that really does invigorate the people of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough and help us plan how nature can recover and where nature recovers, and then plug in those new funding streams to that. So it becomes a really enabling strategy, not a bureaucratic invention. And that will require significant investment in engagement and community engagement so that everybody feels a degree of ownership within all of that. So I think for us, the evolution of the fund, the rollout of the local nature, the development and the rollout of the local nature recovery strategy, really key priorities as we go into next year, along with maintaining that communication and engagement with our stakeholders across the board. I'm happy to take one or two questions on that in the short time we've got left, but let me also just run through some of the key governance announcements that we need to make. Over the course of the year, we have had a couple of trustee resignations, Carol Brain and more recently Sarah Smith from the National Trust. So we do want to recognise their contribution and thank them for their service on the board. In accordance with our constitution, on an annual basis, we have a sort of a refresh of trustees, and several trustees were required to stand down and then seek re-election. And on this occasion, they were Pippa Halings, John Torless, Rob Wise, Rebecca Britton, and Hilary Cox-Condren. All of them sought re-election and were elected at the last Natural Cambridgeshire board meeting. The officers of the charity were also re-elected for another year. That's myself as chair, Matthew Bradbury as vice chair, Matthew Bullock as treasurer, and Roger Mitchell as secretary. And those four officers, together with Hannah Phillips and Peter Lanshoff, make up our Finance and Operations Committee, which is chaired by Roger, and all of those were reappointed to the committee. It's worth noting as well that I have made clear my desire to stand down as chair. I actually was hoping that might happen a little bit earlier, but we're in a process now and we'll be advertising for a new chair. So although I've said I will stand for another year, I'm hoping that that process will happen reasonably quickly. Reasons for that are quite simple. I think, you know, it's very important for each charity to have a new face. And I think I've been doing this for nearly 8 years. So it's probably time for all of you to be listening to somebody else rather than me, and to have sort of a new blood at the helm. So that will be something we'll be advertising in the new year. I'm going to just glance briefly to my guru and mentor on all of this. Roger, have I missed anything on the governance side? No, got it right. That's the one I wanted. I've got one or two questions already in the chat, which I'll just have a quick look at. But before I do, just wanted to thank everybody involved in Natural Cambridgeshire for all their hard work and effort. Everybody on this call, all our partners, particularly the trustees, and of course, particularly Helen and Pamela for all their hard work. We have, you know, really had an awful lot to do over the last 12 months, and not enough resource. Even with Helen and Pamela in place, there's still much more for us to do. And with 2 part-time roles, it's still quite a stretch. So I'm very grateful to you both for all your efforts and hard work in keeping us going. So questions for Natural Cambridgeshire. Wendy, do we have a statement about ethical supply chain donors and investors, given the heavy involvement of overseas investors in Cambridgeshire? I think, Wendy, we don't have such a statement at the moment. We ought to have. In terms of our funding comes either from combined authority, the local authorities, or partners are encouraged to make small contributions once a year. So we certainly don't have any investment or involvement of overseas investors, but it might be one we need to look at and make sure we have a policy on. So thank you for prompting that. Do I have any other questions or points anyone would like to raise about Natural Cambridgeshire's work or anything I've mentioned on the trustees? Seeing absolute silence. Obviously, would encourage you to read the documents, and they're full of really good information about not only our activity, but more importantly, the overall activity of the partners and how we are collectively trying to achieve that doubling nature agenda. If I don't have any more comments or questions, then I've succeeded, because I've not only finished on time, but actually 5 minutes back in your lives, guys. What more can you ask for? So let me just thank you all very much indeed for everything you've done for Natural Cambridgeshire over the last year. And I reckon on the 14th of December, I am fully entitled to wish you all a very happy Christmas and a happy new year. Thanks so much, everybody. Very good. Daniel, if you're still there, I forgot to thank the speakers. I really apologise for that, because you were brilliant.
Yeah, that's what I'm on now, Richard. Just I was just flicking through the questions to make sure I'd answered all of them, and yeah, no, it's a really interesting conversation about peat, isn't it? And
yes.
Yeah, there's obviously a huge amount happening, which is very welcome, to be honest, and probably long overdue. But
the trouble with all these things, the more they find out, the more complicated it becomes. I was fascinated by those points. So I think it was you were making them about the fact the peat, the underlying peat, as well. It just gets more and more complicated, doesn't it?
Yeah, you have to go several meters down to really understand what's going on, and because the drainage ditches are sometimes 2 meters down, even below surface peat is oxidizing and being lost. Because otherwise people are scratching them. Why are the roads still subsiding? When all the peat is gone, it's because the surface is, the below surface stuff, the deep peats are now also in trouble.
Yes, as I say, it's kind of like sometimes you veer between optimism and just despondency. And with each fact that you're given, you go a different way, don't you, sometimes?
Yeah, just got to keep going,
Very good. Great stuff.
Right. Nice to see you all. Thank you for inviting me again.
And Peter, thanks for organising as ever. Really good.
Thank you. We're still recording, aren't we?
I think we are. Yeah.